Interesting, I think. We talk a lot about the strengths of Russia, but again, we need to look also at the weaknesses. Even a country like Kazakhstan, who's very closely embraced by Russia, and Belarus, of course, I mean, they are very well aware that they have these compatriots that Russia can use very efficiently. And you can see how they try in every way to break out of this embrace. And of course, the limits are very clear for how far they can go, but they definitely go that far. So I would say, yes, they can use the compatriots, but it also raises a warning bell in, for example, Kazakhstan and Belarus when they do so.
Excellent. And to you, Magnus, you talked about, you said it's not really about propaganda, but I am curious because it does seem that even if it's not traditional propaganda, it does seem that there is a degree of information, attempts to influence, using information to influence towards political gains. And perhaps it's not just about the traditional style of propaganda of saying we are 100% right, it's maybe more about confusing the West. And that kind of gets back to, I guess, the issue that's been discussing here, which is from a Russian point of view, from Putin's point of view, the West is not more holy than we are. So if you're able to confuse them, you're essentially saying that we're all equal players. But I'm curious to hear some more reflections on this, and also the role of media in addressing some of these challenges.
Well, I mean, in a stereotypical way, one could say that propaganda belongs to sort of the modern project, and the ability to control a story. You control the media, and then you can control a story which begins at one point and ends in another, and then it's just sort of the ability to spread that around within your empire or within your sphere. But this is built more of on a postmodern condition, in the sense that there are no coherent stories. And so in that sense, it's not propaganda that we know from authoritarian regimes. It's more a disruptive campaign, mixing truths with lies, etc., etc. And my fundamental, our language builds upon some kind of notion of what kind of opponent or what kind of challenge we're facing. So in that sense, I believe that we should develop some kind of other toolbox to deal with this electronic dictatorship, which works and operates in a different way.
So in many ways, just as a quick follow-up, in many ways, Putin and sort of Russian information campaigns are very much utilizing the openness and sort of the liberalism of our societies, is what you're saying. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. All right, let's open this up for questions. I think this has been a terrific discussion. Already see a couple of hands. Let's start with Ambassador over here.
Lithuania, so my first question is to the Andras. Is very much agree with this strategic approach of Putin not being only opportunistic but more strategic. Fully agree that the picture is full picture is energy, propaganda, investing in the political parties, corruption, because the ultimate aim is, fully agree with you, is disrupt Western societies. But we should not only blame Putin, which is easy way, we should blame ourselves. For many years we allow Russians to invest in our property. Look to London, look to other towns. And this is where we allow Putin to use Western liberal institutions, liberal system to actually corrupt ourselves. So my question to you, Andras, Putin is strategic. What conditions need for us to become strategic in a way to cope with this all the Putin policy? And to Caroline, are we still able to somehow influence the Russian society? Because this is the question which we debate in Lithuania. I listen to my friend and former boss, Ušackas, EU ambassador, who is actually convinced that there are some opportunities to convince, to approach Russians, to find the friends, embryonic friends. What is your stance on this?
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So let's address those questions first, if the panel wants to jump in.
Go ahead.
Okay, shall I start with how to influence Russian society? First of all, the first thing that we need to understand is that change can only come from inside Russia. I think sometimes we overemphasize our ability to push certain buttons and generate a specific response inside Russia, and usually we get the reverse response. Having said that, it's not the same as saying it doesn't matter what we do. it matters very much. And I'm very much in line with what you said there. It's a very long and tedious process. We have to have a long strategic view of where we want to be the day that Russia actually changes, so that we haven't undermined the values that we united around and built economic growth and freedom on, just to, for example, construct counter-propaganda. How can we support the Russian society? Well, I often quote Lilia Shevtsova when she was here in Stockholm. She got exactly that question: what can we do? And she said, practice what you preach. So there's bad news. Russia has challenged us. The good news is that many of the things that we need to do involve strengthening the institutions that have already worked very well for us. And this is something that we can do not just as a response to the Russian challenge, but simply because it's good for our societies. And you touched, I think, on the question of corruption. I mean, combating corruption in all of the European countries, I think that's a very good place to start. Whether it doesn't matter where you are on the corruption scale or Transparency International's index. We all need to work on that.
Okay. Magnus, Anders, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I just want to, Ambassador, I'd like to say that, first of all, this is a great question. I do believe that that our attitudes have been, it's like, he's a bulldog. Putin is a bulldog. Or maybe a pit bull. Bulldogs are nice. Pit bulls are not always nice. I'm sorry, pit bull owners. Pit bulls, if they smell weakness, they will jump at you and tear you apart. That is really what he sees. He sees our weaknesses. He exploits our weaknesses to the extent we're surprised, but he checks, he scans Europe. He even scans the United States and says, they're going to be weak, and I can take it a step further. So my response to you is, yes, one of the reasons he is doing this to us is because our responses, our national responses and our institutional responses and our corporate responses have been terribly, terribly weak. I just wish that, one of the attractions of the Russian model is to build a national oligarchy. I mean, you see that in Central Eastern Europe. You're too late to the game, but trust me, if you were about to create your democracy, you would love this. I mean, a national oligarchy, that's beautiful. But I would also say that I wish the European Parliament had adopted a resolution on Russian corruption and Russian oligarchs and visa bans with the same vigor as they have adopted a resolution last week, which I find totally, as a European citizen, totally ridiculous, the resolution they adopted on Mr. Snowden. So I totally concur with you. And so one of the things that we need to do is maybe just start to talk about what we need to do, and maybe not so much in the public all the time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
We are selling out our debates and our propositions and our thinking too early. And I think that's a lesson we have learned.
Magnus, do you want to jump in here?
No.
Okay, so let's go ahead and pick up a few more questions. I see one over here, Aaron, and then we'll move from there. Please.
Thank you very much. My name is Aaron Koreva. I write for the Atlantic Council on the war in Ukraine, among other things. My question is for the entire panel, but maybe particularly for Andres. You mentioned that the Russians and Putin have made sort of in-tours into several European countries and several parts of our societies. Like, are there particular countries and places where they are especially strong, and what could they possibly do? And I'm particularly looking at the beautiful country of you, Andres, with Hungary. I mean, how far is somebody like Orban prepared to, vote no on the sanctions, for example, or something like that? Could you maybe elaborate a little bit on what the plans are?
Thank you. Let's pick up a few more questions, and then we'll address this. We have a two-finger from Mats.
Thank you. To be concrete on further sanctions, I wonder what is your attitude towards, number one, WTO membership of Russia? Can it be revoked, and would that be a good idea? Second, the SWIFT payment system. If you want to contain Russian money and fight corruption, wouldn't it be an easy thing to... well, they can always carry the money in bags over borders, but the SWIFT is helping them, corrupting us.
All right, so we'll take one more. I think we have woman back here has been waving for a long time, so if we can get it all the way back here, please.
Thank you. Anke Schmidt-Weizmann, Swedish Institute of International Affairs. Some of it you have already answered, Carolina, but I did wonder also, Andras and Magnus, how do we know when the problem has become so bad that we have to act upon it? And now I would like to place the focus on European EU member states, European states, even the United States of America, Canada. So how do we know it? Because you have your own lenses, especially from your Hungarian perspective, and also Carolina, and you know it when you see it, but help politicians in European Union member states. How do we know when we have a problem, and who are the actors that should be acting, and how should they be addressing it, domestically and also internationally, and how is that affecting domestic policy and also the external relations policy? So a little bit in the direction of the sanctions, but more broadly speaking, what has to be done to become more strategic, what you prescribed, to be more effective, to be united? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. All right, so we have 3 good questions, and we'll come back with another round of questions. So we have which EU countries are the most susceptible or vulnerable? We have the issue of sanctions, and then the last question here about kind of the domestic politics and the link to foreign policy. Why don't Andras go first?
Let me start with the last one. This is an easy answer. Yuri, Andras, and me, we carry a little gadget, and when it swings into the red, we know we're there, we need to act. No, I'm just kidding. It's a good question. I think when we see hesitation, when we see confusion, when we see political mess, when we see inaction, which, by the way, inaction many times is the provocation more than action, that's when we know that we have allowed them to go too far. When they have messed up our own internal communication on issues which is related to the Russians, and then we have allowed them to go too far. And it's a case in point is, of course, Ukraine, when we allowed them to intrude upon our way of thinking on the Ukraine, to the extent that we basically were totally paralyzed at the beginning. I'd like to answer your question. What was it?
Aaron.
Huh? Aaron. Yeah. Yes. Okay. On the sanctions, Orban is a gambler. He's not an idiot. He will think twice before he disrupts the sanction regime. But if he does not have to pay a very high price, if he sees other weak knees within the European Union, if he sees that others will be with him, which he increasingly thinks he can do, because he's now a hero in many countries because of the way he has acted on the refugee crisis, which I think is really the other extreme, and it is crazy and it's wrong. But I think if he sees weakness, he might, just suggest very strongly, he might argue in favor of lifting the sanctions. So that's a very tricky question. I wouldn't think that if the United States and if the big powers stand firm, he's not going to do it, because he's not an idiot. If he sees hesitation with the big powers, United States, Germany, France, then he might join those, and then he might even be very vocal. He's an opportunist, but as I repeat, he's not an idiot.
All right, thanks. Cara, do you want to respond to anything?
Yes, first of all, the question of when to react. This is the question of the canary in the coal mine. When does it die? Is it too late then already to run? And that's why I think we need to have strategies, and strategies have to be communicated, otherwise they're useless. But as you said, we also have to do things in closed rooms. And I think this is contingency planning, basically. trying to prepare ourselves for the next crisis. And that's best done, I think, in elaborating scenarios and during exercises and doing it in closed rooms. And I can easily come up with really difficult scenarios for any politician that would like to try them. On WTO membership, I mean, this is interesting. Sometimes I get the question, could we have done more to embrace Russia so that we wouldn't be in this position? Actually, the EU was the greatest supporter of WTO membership. I mean, it was almost a greater supporter than Russia was. Now it's inside the WTO and it doesn't work. I think some of these measures that you ask for, not least the SWIFT payment system, perhaps we should hold on to them as something that we weigh with. Because if you look at when the sanctions have been the most effective, it's actually when Russia's been under threat of further sanctions. I also think, let's not get into sanctions that are too costly for us in the long term. In that case, we need a sunset clause. So maybe the ones that we have are enough because they're not too costly to hold on to, and they send a clear political message, and we can always threaten to impose further sanctions. Already today, anyone who wants to make an investment in Russia will have to sit through very tedious negotiations with the compliance officer. This is, again, it's not a formal sanction, but it definitely holds back investments in Russia.
Excellent.
Let me just ask, yes, to this one. I just wonder why we have not mentioned the Magnitsky Act as a very important tool, and why is it that Europe has not embraced the Magnitsky Act?
Do you want to explain to the audience?
Oh, the Magnitsky Act. Well, it's about Sergei Magnitsky, who was a real whistleblower, who discovered a real fraud, and who was working in an investment company owned by an American, Bill Browder, who happened to be the grandson of the Secretary General of the Communist Party of the United States. That's funny. And he discovered this fraud. He reported to the authorities, and instead of persecuting the people who actually were involved in the fraud, they imprisoned Sergei Magnitsky, they tortured him, and he died in prison. And then a few years later, the United States adopted sanctions against those who were involved in Magnitsky's death. I think it's an important tool. It was a very strong message. I just feel so sorry about that not have been embraced more by the U.S. and by Europe. So we do know what we could do, and it really the Russians were scared about the Magnitsky Act. And we then stopped short of introducing more sanctions on these people.
Okay, Magnus?
Well, at the face of it, maybe that could seem like a contradiction. On the one hand, live is to learn. On the other hand, take the game to Moscow. But I think that my answer to this would be, it's a bit of a cliche, but it's about leadership and it's about priorities. And I'll just mention two situations where I believe that U.S. and European leadership could have shifted in a different position. One was the American response to Russia's Syrian campaign, which was perhaps not the clearest of responses. And when President Obama says that we're not going to engage in a Cold War chess game, that is actually exactly the kind of danger signaling to Moscow regarding security in our part of the world that we do not want to see. And secondly, is of course the way European diplomacy works today. And to me, Minsk too is an example of how it works today. The Brits are nowhere to be seen. It is the Germans.
The Americans.
It is the Germans and the French that actually sort of basically make a deal with Moscow. sort of forcing Minsk into complying something that is basically not in their fundamental security interest, and which creates some kind of quasi-sovereignty for Russian-sponsored actors. So in that sense, I believe there are a lot of things that European and American leadership can do in signaling to Moscow, and specifically regarding WTO and SWIFT, and the INF Treaty as well. I mean, there are a number of ways that you, in skillful diplomacy, can actually, I mean, you don't have to wreck the ship yourself, but you can actually force the Russians to take the blame for sort of leaving the regime in practice.
And another thing that you could do pertaining to sanctions that a colleague of mine in Washington, David Kramer, has suggested, pertaining to sanctions, is to somehow freeze the assets of RT. So this would be a way to specifically address Russian propaganda, information warfare, to go after sort of the vehicles that they're using. So we have a couple of more questions. Let's go over here first. Please introduce yourself.
Hello, my name is Carl Dyborn. I'm from the Lund University. I can't help but notice one thing, that you talk as if Putin is alone. But in my view, he's not alone. He has the backing of China, which has issued similar views on democracy, human rights, the purpose of the state, etc. So how do you view this, that he is not the fact alone, he's not doing this alone, that he has backing of one of the most biggest power in the world today?
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we have one patiently waiting man over here.
Thank you. Andras Schwartz from the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. Just one very short question, particular to Karolina, but of course others are also welcome. So far we've been speaking about how concerned we are of a strong Russia, right? Are we concerned of a weak Russia as well? Because there is only one thing worse than a strong authoritarian system. The thing worse is when the strong authoritarian system is falling apart. And the end is coming. First, no one lives forever, not even Vladimir